Today we're going to take a look at multiplying and dividing integers. Now remember, multiplication and division are inverse operations. So I'm going to give you the rules. I'm going to use a plus sign for positive and a negative sign. That's for negative, okay? So multiplication. If I multiply two positive numbers, all of you know that your answer will be positive. If I multiply two negative numbers, my answer will be positive. And if I multiply two numbers with unlike signs, my answer will be negative. Because multiplication and division are inverse operations, if I divide two positives, my answer is positive. If I divide two negatives, my answer is positive. And if I divide two numbers with unlike signs, my answer will be negative. So what do I need to remember for multiplication and division? If I'm multiplying or dividing two numbers with the same sign, my answer is positive. If I'm multiplying or dividing two numbers with unlike signs, my answer will always be negative. Well, let's see what happens when I multiply more than two numbers, okay? So, if I have an even number of positive factors, my answer will be positive. In other words, if I gave you, let's say I gave you 7 factors to multiply, and of the 7, 4 of them are positive. So that means that if I have an even number of positives in there, my answer would be positive. If I have an odd number of negative factors, my answer will be negative. A quick example right quick. If I gave you 3 times a negative 4 times a negative 2 times 5 times 6. Well, I have an even number of negative factors, so when I finish, this answer is going to be positive. But if I gave you a negative 3 times a negative 4 times a negative 2 times 5 times 6, I have an odd number of negative factors, so when I finish, my answer is going to be negative. So let's take these rules and let's apply them and multiply and divide some numbers right quick. So let's find each product or quotient. Example 1. If I had a negative 3 times 4, a negative times a positive gives you a negative, so I get a negative 12. Example 2. If I had 7 times a negative 3 times a negative 2. Remember, we multiply two numbers at a time. 7 times a negative 3 is a negative 21. Now multiply the negative 21 by the negative 2, I get a positive 42. Or I could have multiplied a negative 3 times a negative 2 and get 6 and have 7 times 6 and I still get my 42. Example 3. If I had a negative 15 divided by a negative 3. A negative divided by a negative gives you a positive. 15 divided by 3 gives you 5, so you get a positive 5. Example 4. If I had a negative 56 divided by 7. A negative divided by a positive gives us a negative, so my answer would be a negative 8. Example 5. If I had a negative 16 times a negative 2, I have a negative times a negative. A negative times a negative is a positive. 16 times 2 gives me 32. Example 6. If I had a negative 45 divided by a negative 9. A negative 45 divided by a negative 9, negative divided by a negative is a positive, so I get a positive 5 as an answer. Example 7, if I had a negative 9 times a negative 7. A negative times a negative is a positive. 9 times 7 gives you 63. So as you see, what you need to do, you've got to make sure that you know your facts, that you know your basic facts, okay? Then apply the rules. Example 8. If I had a negative 3 times a negative 4 times 0 times a negative 5. Well, 0 times any number gives you 0. So my answer is 0. If I multiply here, I get a 12. 0 times a negative 5 is 0. And 12 times 0 gives you 0. 0 times a number gives you 0. You never put a sign with 0. It does not carry a positive sign. It does not carry a negative sign. Example 9. If I had a negative 81 divided by 9. A negative divided by a positive gives me a negative, so my answer is a negative 9. Example 10, if I had a negative 12 times a negative 3. A negative times a negative is a positive, so that gives me a positive 36. Example 11, if I had a negative 36 divided by 6. A negative divided by a positive gives me a negative, so I get a negative 6. Example 12, if I had a negative 72 divided by a negative 9. A negative divided by a negative is a positive, so my answer is a positive 8. Example 13. Sometimes the problems may be written like this. You may have a negative 24 divided by a negative 8. Remember, a fraction bar indicates division. I read that as negative 24 divided by negative 8. Negative divided by negative is a positive. I get a positive 3. Example 14. If I had a negative 54 divided by 9. A negative 54 divided by, that's a fraction bar, 9 gives me a negative 6. And example number 15, if I had a negative 4 times 3 times a negative 2 times a negative 1. I have an odd number of negatives, so when I finish, my answer should be negative. A negative 4 times a positive 3 is a negative 12. A negative 2 times a negative 1 is a positive 2. And a negative 12 times 2 gives you a negative 24.